I recently saw the new film, The Boys in the Boat, directed by George Clooney. It's a sports drama set in 1936 based on the true story of the University of Washington rowing team. I was pleasantly surprised by this movie, mostly because I'm not really the target demographic and this isn't the type of film I usually enjoy, but I found the story to be pretty fascinating and it was able to emotionally draw me in. The cast isn't full of many big name stars, which actually works pretty well for this story about a bunch of unknown underdogs with the odds stacked against them. The fact that there aren't many big names helps the feel of these team members that are plucked out of obscurity. The two cast members that I'm the most familiar with are Joel Edgerton, who plays the coach, and Callum Turner, who plays the main character who gets on the rowing team. I don't think that's much of a spoiler, you can assume that'll happen, and it's in the trailer. As far as the performances go, I thought they were fine. It's difficult for me to have strong feelings when it's such a grounded story. I think the acting fits the characters, they were likable, they had their angsty and emotional moments just like they were supposed to. One thing about Callum's character that I specifically liked was how we were shown his struggle with poverty and his shame of being poor in comparison to his classmates. I'm not really a sports movie kind of girl. Like, I never watch these kinds of movies. I don't like sports, I don't watch sports, I'm not interested in sports. This movie also, in particular, screams Oscar bait. The story, the tone, the director. I am so not drawn to these types of movies. They just feel so boring and repetitive, unoriginal, but at the same time feel like they're trying too hard. And all of that makes it pretty easy to hate on and have assumptions ahead of time. Like, I would never voluntarily go see this movie. I know I'm going really hard on this movie at the moment, but I'll come back around to showing why I liked it in a second. I'm much more interested in films that take a big swing, even if it may be a miss. I don't mean to bring this up in another video, but Saltburn. I mean, that movie had a ton of issues, but it still was the most creative, original, interesting movie of the year for me, and therefore was one of my favorites. Sorry to bring up Poor Things again, too. I haven't seen it yet, but that's one of my most anticipated movies of the year because you can just see how weird it is from the trailer. By the way, those two movies tell you everything you need to know about my taste in movies. But anyway, back to The Boys on the Boat. Maybe it's because I'm not the target demographic, like I said, but I haven't seen any marketing for this movie. I've seen no trailers, commercials, billboards, or any kind of online buzz about it, unless I go out of my way to find it. Usually these kinds of movies overdo it with the marketing, so I'm not sure what's going on here, but I think they need to step it up if they want any chance of competing with other big Christmas movies coming out this year, like Wonka. Once I started looking into the movie, I did see a lot of negative buzz or assumptions people were making, which was a lot of what I've already brought up. It looks boring, it looks like Oscar bait, and that's kind of what I went into the movie expecting. Maybe that's why I ended up liking it so much. Set low expectations and you'll probably leave pretty happy. So maybe I shouldn't be telling you that it was good, because now you're going to go into it expecting a lot. The most important thing to me when it comes to a film is enjoyment. The technical aspects can be perfect, but if it's not keeping me interested in the story and the characters, getting me emotionally invested, it doesn't really matter. And in this film, those elements really worked for me. I'm really drawn to underdog stories, so I love seeing this team, made up of a bunch of guys who have never rowed before, overcome everyone's expectations of them, and go up against people who have more resources, more history, and experience. One critique that could go along with that is that it's pretty predictable, which you can just tell from the type of movie it is. Family, sports, Oscar bait movie based on a true story. It's predictable, and I don't know if it's saying anything particularly original or new, but at the same time, sometimes you just want a movie like that. Something that's just easy to watch and that'll make you feel good and warm and inspired. This movie is rated PG-13, and I, for the life of me, cannot figure out why. I think it's completely appropriate for all ages, so it's a good movie to take your family to for Christmas. This movie is 2 hours, 4 minutes long. I think it was paced pretty well. It maybe could have been pared down a little bit, but I think it was a pretty good length. I was invested throughout, meeting the main character and his struggles, watching him try out for the team, watching them train together, and eventually compete. I do think the characters feel a little underdeveloped, like they're just generally one entity rather than 8 men and 3 coaches. But in spite of that, I just couldn't help rooting for them. The music also really helps with that. The music needs to be good, it needs to help me feel things, it needs to help set the tone of the film, and I feel like the music fits in perfectly here. It's maybe a little plain, traditional, but it did stand out more than most scores I hear these days. There are also some funny moments which helped with the overall light tone. I thought the setting was super interesting. I don't even remember the last time I watched a movie set in this time period, specifically focusing on the Great Depression. I feel like this decade is commonly overlooked in favor of World War II movies. I liked being immersed in this more unique atmosphere with a mostly apolitical narrative, Americana vibes. The setting is obviously perfect too for establishing this underdog story. One of my favorite things about this movie was the physical sets. Every one of them felt so authentic to the time period. Every single room felt so lived in and intricate. Again, this era isn't something I see a lot, and it's paired with a nautical setting. So these sets were always really visually interesting to examine and unpack. From the boat workshop, the coach's office, the coach's house, it was just all so well done. I've never seen anything directed by George Clooney before, so I can't really speak at all to his history or tendencies. Like I said before, I think this film has a really distinct setting, but I don't think there was a super distinct style. Because of that, I do think this movie will become forgettable in my mind over time. I do want to talk about some of the weak spots. It didn't feel super polished to me, and granted, it's ambitious in the sense that it's a period film, there's a lot of moving pieces to manage, and relatively, there were so many things that did go right. But there were a decent amount of things that went wrong that it started becoming a pattern. And for the most part, these didn't feel like creative decisions, they felt like oversights. Between the screenplay, lighting, cinematography, and editing, there were a few things that didn't work. It happened rarely, but there were bad green screen moments. Weird backlighting with lens flare for entire conversations where it didn't feel like an intentional choice. There would be these close-up camera angles that didn't quite work where you can't really see faces. During some of the races, there were these intentional camera movements that were clearly a creative decision. They were these swoopy shots to help the audience feel this desperation and energy in the race, but they were just so repetitive, ugly, and awkward. But I do recognize that that instance specifically was a creative choice that I personally just didn't like. But then again, there were some camera shots that were very intentional and were visually interesting and added layers to the story. Another big issue I had was the intention of the scene or dialogue not being clear. And this could have been because of the screenplay, cinematography, editing, or acting, or a combination of all of them. I'm going to tell you a few examples that aren't spoilers at all. You know the main character makes the rowing team. I mean, that's just obvious. But just watching the film, I couldn't tell whether he made the team. I didn't know his name when it was called. I still don't know his name. He had a very subtle reaction, and it wasn't helped by the camera shot or the background music. Nothing made it clear that it was this triumphant moment for the protagonist. Another example is when they're explaining the roles of each position on the boat. They don't really emphasize with the camera movement or acting which boat position we're talking about. Those are just examples of scenes where they could have done something to make these things more obvious to the viewer. The screenplay and editing could have been improved because there were plot points that were just dropped or things that may have been cut out, so some conversations or events just didn't make sense. There were also some cringy additions to me where it just felt so over the top and like a caricature. My specific example of that is in my Letterboxd review if you're interested. It's just a spoiler, so I didn't want to talk about that here. So I think that captures all my thoughts. TLDR, I didn't expect much out of this movie. It looked pretty basic, and it was basic, and it wasn't perfect, but sometimes that's exactly what you need out of a movie. It was easy to watch, made me feel good, kept me entertained, and I liked it overall. That's it for my spoiler-free review and discussion of The Boys in the Boat. See you next time!